Needs to grab lunch and sit down, we can get underway. Thank you all for coming. Terrific turnout. I'm Bill Shambra, Director of the Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal at the Hudson Institute here in town. Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled Race and Racism in America, Are We Now a Colorblind Society? But first, a word about our series, since so many of you, I suspect, are first-timers. The Bradley Center typically sponsors a panel once every month with the generous help of the Bradley Foundation and Atlantic Philanthropies. As most of you know, discourse in philanthropy tends to be very pleasant and innocuous and really, really boring. Because it carefully skirts issues that might generate controversy and therefore might actually be interesting. Our panels, by contrast, are meant to be lively and provocative, bringing together a diversity of views and disciplines to examine issues of interest to the sector. If that's the sort of thing that you find appealing, please be sure that you're on our mailing list. Now you may well say, if that's so, why couldn't we come up with a provocative issue for today's panel? Well, we did our best, and I think you have a treat in store for you as our four panelists tackle the topic, Race and Racism in America, Are We Now a Colorblind Society? One of our panelists, Sterling Spurn, along with two of his fellow foundation presidents, wrote an op-ed for the most recent Chronicle of Philanthropy entitled Foundations Must Conquer Myths in Order to Lead on Diversity. And one of the myths, they argued, was that diversity is just about skin color and head counts. Instead, they suggested, we need to dig deeper to improve justice, impartiality, and fairness in how society's institutions operate and distribute resources. 1 year ago, the Kellogg Foundation launched a 5-year, $75 million initiative entitled America Healing, the point of which was precisely to tackle the systemic unfairness, the structural racism embedded in our society's institutions. We're extremely fortunate to have with us today to discuss this bold new venture both the president of the Kellogg Foundation, Sterling Spurn, as well as the Kellogg Vice President for Program Strategy in charge of the America Healing Initiative, Dr. Gail Christopher. Coming at the issue in a slightly different, from a slightly different point of view, we're also pleased to have with us Dr. Stephen Thernstrom of Harvard University, who wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal discussing this initiative, as well as Ron Christie, a political consultant and author of a very recent book, Acting White, The Curious History of a Racial Slur. We'll hear first from Mr. Spurn, followed by Professor Thernstrom, Dr. Christopher, and Mr. Christie. I will then try to stir things up, assuming that we've had no differences among the panelists. I will try to introduce the notion of controversy, and then we'll turn to the audience for Q&A.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, everybody. I think it's a testimony to part of why we had launched the American Healing Project, which we think there's a great appetite in our country for people to come together and talk about issues of race. And as we launch this initiative, I suppose I should be thankful to Professor Thernstrom for writing that op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal. And we know we're joining a dialogue that is not new to this country. And in fact, I would encourage you to look at the dialogue that Bill Shambra himself helped stimulate in an ongoing way, but in the Chronicle of Philanthropy in recent years. And I think lots of people in our field have made out the case for the data on disparities. And I suspect, although I'll wait to hear from my colleagues, that the people on this panel don't disagree with the answer, are we a colorblind society? I suspect we would all acknowledge we are not. But I suppose we differ greatly on how it is we might achieve a colorblind society at some point. I also know that our America Healing Initiative is to encourage people to have courageous conversations about race so that we can get on to the larger issues of solving the community's problems that face our children, our kids, our communities in health, in education, and a wide variety of economic opportunity issues. So it is definitely a means to a larger end. Let me also say that our founder, Will Keith Kellogg, who was born in 1860, just before the outbreak of the Civil War, was the son of abolitionists and grew up at a time when Sojourner Truth spent the last 25 years of her life in Battle Creek, Michigan. I also want to note our foundation at the corner of Michigan and Capitol Avenues in downtown Battle Creek is built on the site of the Underground Railroad. And we commissioned a large sculpture across the Battle Creek River to commemorate that event. So the other thing is Mr. Kellogg, and I say to people, may you be blessed with founders who are pure of heart, clear of intent, and whose hands are off. His instructions to the founding Board of Trustees and staff in 1930 were do whatever you please so long as it promotes the health, happiness, and well-being of children. And we take that mandate very seriously. And throughout his life, he was a very hands-off founding donor. He did come quickly to believe in what we call the education gospel, and that a good education is the greatest way to improve one generation over another. And his thoughts about society and social change, especially focusing on children, were largely shaped by his participation in the White House Conference on Children, which President Hoover at that time asked him to help stage and co-convene. And a very interesting report emerged from that conference. I want to read a short blurb that Bruce Leslie and First Focus produced on children's policy of the 20th century. This is a report on the 1929-30 White House Conference on the Standards of Child Welfare. It said this massive undertaking brought together experts across the country over a 16-month period, culminating in November 1990 Washington meeting. 4 committees focusing on medical, public health, education and training, and disability issues issued a 643-page report to 3,000 attendees. Labor Secretary James Davis in that session called for special federal efforts to help those he described as socially handicapped. And how did he define children who are socially handicapped? Those in foster homes, in the juvenile justice system, and Black and Indian children. And I was struck by the reference as early as 1930 that a child's participation in certain systems or their particular ethnic or racial characteristics would inherently cause them to be handicapped, that the society might around them construct structures and systems that would cause them to be socially handicapped. We've made great strides in the areas of racial equity in our society since the founding of this country, and we have a long way to go. With the mandate and a vision that all children in our country would thrive, our board of trustees and staff sat in recent years and asked ourselves, who is a vulnerable child? Mr. Kellogg himself was a vulnerable kid. He dropped out of school in 5th grade because his teachers had low expectations of him. He was considered dim-witted because, like me, he couldn't see the blackboard without his eyeglasses. Unfortunately, like a lot of poor kids in our country today, he wasn't diagnosed with his nearsightedness until he was 20 years old. So he dropped out and sold brooms for his family, and despite his success as a hard-working, self-made man, ultimately later in his life, he never forgot his connections to vulnerable children and forgotten children, whether they were kids in rural communities, whether they were kids with handicaps, whether they were kids who were poor, or whether they were kids because of the color of their skin faced greater obstacles than others. So when we launched the America Healing Initiative, we did this because of our historic commitment to promoting racial equity and undoing the disparities in health, in education, in the communities we work. This was, in a sense, a continuation of work that had been going on at the foundation for some decades, but we did feel it was critical if we were going to help communities solve their problems, and we would bring our notion of helping people help themselves through the practical application of knowledge, that we had to be able to convene people and talk with people and enable them to have courageous conversations about race. and historic and structural racism and current racism. I was struck with reading Mr. Christie's book, which I greatly valued. I saw, Ron, that you used an epigraph from Faulkner at the opening of the book. There's another great saying of William Faulkner which says, "The past is not dead. The past isn't even in the past. The past is alive now." And we don't dwell in the past. We dwell on the impacts of the past that hold us back to fulfilling the great potential of our children and their communities today. And the American Healing Initiative, and I hope that Gail and I will be able to share some examples later on, is proof to us that when over 1,000 organizations around the country responded to our RFP over a year ago, from all kinds of organizations, we were surprised at the appetite in our communities for people to have courageous conversations. And we appreciate, we've gotten to know Governor Winter in Mississippi, given our work there, and we support the Winter Center for Racial Reconciliation. But Governor Winter was the one who went to President Clinton and encouraged him to host a national conversation on race. We don't find that opening the conversation to be about race is necessarily the only or most effective way to help communities deal with issues of racial inequity. But if they don't have a language and a courage to talk about it, we don't think we will get to the point where every third grader is on grade level and every high school kid graduates from high school, where every child has a medical home, every kid is born healthy and achieves their optimal outcomes. So we have found over and over in the communities we work that people are hungry and eager for someone to bring the issue of race and the abilities to talk about it into the room in a way that helps people work towards solutions. And I appreciate reading Dr. Thernstrom's book. We are past an era that might be stereotyped or characterized as one of black anger and white guilt. We find people across the racial spectrum want to talk about race and don't want to run to the corners of the room and say, as long as get this over, we'll go back to business as usual. We need to start a new chapter in this country of how we talk positively about the past and the present so that we can have success for all of our children. So I'm looking forward to this dialogue. And again, I hope you all came here not to be under the bright lights of a real-time web streaming debate or feeling like we're in a coliseum and the gladiators are up here, because you've seen those kinds of discussions. And that's not the kind of dialogue that we are trying to foster. And I want to thank Bill Shambra for creating this space. And I think it's not only a few opening salvos from people that get to sit on this panel, but the ideas and issues and inspirations that you have. And for me, you represent a typical community that we might be working with in this country. Whether people come to talk about their public schools, they come to talk about their healthcare system. As I said, Gail will probably share lots of examples, and I can too, but it is people that want to get success for their vulnerable kids, and being able to talk about racial issues is one of the key tools that will help them get there. Thank you, and I'll look forward to the dialogue.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. As was mentioned in the introduction, I did write a quick little piece about what the Kellogg Foundation is doing in this area, and it was rather critical. I can't pretend to be a real expert in what they're doing, but I did respond rather negatively to the rationale for it, and also have reservations about whether it will in fact move us in a positive direction. First though, let me say in answer to the question, are we now a colorblind society? As Mr. Burns suggested, there probably is broad agreement on that we are not today. Indeed, what people of my kind of ideological inclinations call for is colorblind public policy, with the belief that over time that is most likely to lead us to a colorblind society. But there is a question about the goal. I think some would say a colorblind society would be one in which we are blind to every aspect of strangers we encounter, anything about their appearance, their accent, their gestures, their name, any cue as to their ethnic or racial background, we somehow shouldn't recognize. And that's not my vision of a colorblind society. We are, after all, a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic society, and we will continue for a long time to come to be such a society and to perceive differences in others. I expect that a half a century from now, there still will be black churches. I do not expect that all of our churches will have the same racial composition, and for some, that is what integration requires. Well, I think that's a false vision, and that instead I can conceive of a future with black churches, black institutions of higher education, black social organizations of every kind, just as there are Jewish organizations of various kinds, just as there are Armenian American organizations of every kind. So I think we would like the law and the public power to be race blind, but in the society we will have many group differences. And some of those will involve frictions and negative feelings about others. One definition of an ethnic group is a collection of people united by a myth of common ancestry and a common dislike of their neighbors. Now, that may not be innate to ethnicity, but there will be group rivalries and negative feelings across groups, and we will never be able to obliterate them. Now, I'm taking as my foil for my remarks an essay by Dr. Christopher, Healing America, a Funder's Commitment to Racial Equality, which sketches the rationale for the Kellogg Plan, and I do find it troubling in various ways. There are two central premises. One, that the great problem in our society today is white privilege. Now, I've read this fairly carefully in other works in this vein, and I can't really find out quite what white privilege is and how you know when you've identified it. As it is presented in the literature that I've read, at least, it simply consists of a recitation of racial disparities of various kinds. Blacks have higher unemployment rates, higher poverty rates, lower rate of within wedlock births, whatever it is, ergo white privilege. And I find this pretty simplistic. My wife and I have written 2 books that deal at great length with various kinds of racial disparities, and we find in almost all cases many other explanations that are more concrete, empirical, tangible, that do not lead one to conclude we have a suffocating reign of white privilege. Dr. Christopher also contends the other central premise is that today we have, quote, a blatant social racial caste system in the United States. Today we have a caste system. Well, we did have a caste system in the southern United States right down to the 1960s, and it is unrecognizably different from our society today. Take a little glance at John Dollard's classic Caste and Class in a southern town. In that town and throughout the South, blacks literally were an untouchable caste. Whites did not shake hands with them. They were supposed to enter the back door of a White House. They did not dine together or drink together. Well, is there anything like that today? It's strange. The occupant of the White House is a member of the untouchable caste. We have powerful chairmen of congressional committees, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and so on. That doesn't square well with that notion. But look at more fundamental indicators of racial interaction. For example, we have, oops, I'm missing a page here, my notes. Yes. As of the most recent survey of this kind, 2005, 92% of African Americans said they had fairly close personal friends who were white. 79% of whites had close friends who were black. In 2005, 63% of blacks had had a white family to dinner at their home. 49% of whites had entertained blacks in their home. Our schools, as part of her argument, is a claim our schools are more segregated today than ever before. This, I think, is totally misguided, as is evidenced from a recent survey of graduating high school seniors. 79% of whites had a close friend who was black. 82% of blacks had close white friends. Then, most important, at the very heart of the caste system was sexual fear. Black men were lynched for even looking at a white woman in the wrong way. However, today we have these figures, for example, on dating across, oops, where did those go? No, somehow my notes got a little wrong. But out of memory, I will say, as of 2006, a Washington Post Kaiser Foundation poll found that roughly 50% of African Americans had dated a white person, and 25% of whites had dated a black person. This, in many cases, ultimately leads to marriage. The interracial marriage rate has gone from, 0.1% to 15% of blacks marrying today marry someone of another race, and among black males it's 22%. So I think the idea this is anything remotely like a caste system is very misguided. Then finally, the strategy and approach. I appreciated Mr. Spearn's spirit, his welcome of open and frank dialogue. I have to say that the Clinton National Race Dialogue did not generate, in my view, anything remotely like that, and many of the people who call for such dialogue don't really want a dialogue. They want, in Dr. Christopher's words, for blacks to explain, quote, the painful experiences and destructive impact associated with our national, individual, and group racial wounds, and for whites to say, at last I get it. I agree with you. What should we do about it? As a nice example of what has not been frank about that dialogue, at Akron, President Clinton, in taking questions from the audience, a young man, he called for frank dialogue, and a young man stood up and said, well, frankly, I'm very worried about walking down the street at night when I encounter black people. I'm worried about getting mugged. And President Clinton's response to that was to say, what movies or television programs have you seen that have given you such a warped idea that blacks are any more likely to mug you than anyone else? And there, I would say, you don't need to watch any movies or television, where in fact blacks are greatly underrepresented, as offender studies have shown. You need only look at the crime statistics. There are huge racial disparities in the rate at which crimes are committed. And young urban blacks are far more likely to be muggers than young urban whites. That's a frank statement, and that I would be happy to debate. So in sum, I am somewhat doubtful that the effort being made here will in fact produce genuine racial dialogue. And the final point I would make on that is the best kind of dialogue across racial lines is not dialogue about race. It's dialogue about whether the Knicks will beat the Celtics in the first round of the playoffs. It's dialogue about what's going on in this weird war in Libya. It's dialogue not focused on race, because in fact, we are all people with many common interests to talk about, and a call for a dialogue on race sets us in opposing camps. Oh, you're the spokesman for the white position, and you're the spokesman for the black position. That, I don't think, is likely to lead us to a better society.
Good afternoon. It's both an honor and I guess humbling to be the focus of the presentation, the panel today. I didn't quite anticipate the level of the nature in which things might be framed, although I should have. Let me first clarify that the work that the Kellogg is doing is in response in many ways to expressed interest and need by so many communities around this country. We recently brought together about 15 of the leaders who've been doing this work. We brought them together to hear from them about their progress, about their core principles, about their values. What was impressive to us was that to a person, the focus is really not on race, but on our common humanity. And how do we achieve that? How do we move from a nation that has never really been honest about the centuries of denial of the humanity of one group of people, not just one, but many groups, based on physical characteristics? How do we move from the legacy of those centuries of misguided, to use your word, Professor Thernstrom, of misguided perceptions about our collective humanity? So it's clear that the people that are doing this work are not doing it to further divide, but rather to unite us within local communities. To suggest that there is not a need for this work, or that this work might not be effective, I think smacks of a certain amount of arrogance and assumption. But the good thing about America is we get to do that. We get to have multiple points of view. So I respectfully hear your skepticism and indeed your criticism, Professor Thernstrom. But I also hear the voices of the people who are in fact doing this work in a courageous way within their communities. So what did they tell us? They told us that in addition to the principle of focusing on our oneness and our collective humanity, they provide safe spaces for sharing the stories of human experience. Is that a victim-oppressor frame? In some cases, the experiences have been experiences of horror, guided by misguided belief systems. In some cases, the stories are stories of reconciliation and heightened awareness. There was one story that was extremely moving for me that I'd like to share with you, and respect the anonymity to the degree that I can. But it was of a young man. He wasn't young at the time, but he was telling the story of his youth, where he was involved in a protest around a labor movement. And unfortunately, that protest turned violent. And members of a particular racist group decided that they would shoot and kill some of the protesters. So he had had the experience of cradling in his arms a dying friend and literally trying to hold her head together, which had been shot. And years later, after he had grown tremendously as a person and had actually become a minister, he was called to the bedside of the individual that had perpetrated that crime, along with one of the descendants of the woman who had been killed. And he wanted to apologize. The person who had done this wanted to apologize. And he did that. But what he said was, "But I cannot forgive myself." And so here this African-American man, who was now a minister, a man of the cloth, he had to say to this person, "God forgives you." He didn't really believe it when he said it, but after careful thought, when he was speaking to his congregation that Sunday, he did believe it, and he understood the complexity, and he understood what forgiveness is about. Was that a healing moment for him? Was that a healing moment for us when we heard that story? Yes, it was. There are many, many, many stories that are being told around this country, and there is power in story. What the neuroscience teaches us today that we didn't know, perhaps in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, we didn't know the power of adverse experiences on the brain development and on the health of people in society. We didn't also understand the power of sharing and communicating as perhaps being a vehicle for healing. But as we have a more nuanced appreciation of the molecular biology and how stress manifests in every cell and throughout the brain, we can perhaps see more value in a more grounded opportunity to share our experiences. Yes, the data would suggest that we've made dramatic progress as a nation, but the data would also suggest that we are at risk because so many of our children of color in this society are impoverished, in low-income situations, and are not in schools that are causing them to get the educational background that they will need to succeed. We believe that equipping our nation's teachers, our nation's doctors, our nation's police officers, our nation's social workers with the skills to understand the impact of a racialized society will make them more effective in meeting the needs of those children. Race is a myth. Racism is a set of beliefs that help to shape this nation. To suggest that centuries of institutionalizing those beliefs could suddenly be eradicated in less than 75 years is, I believe, simplistic and misguided, naive at best. It took this nation centuries to embed the mythology of racial difference into every institution and system that we have, from medical experimentation to criminal justice cruelty and disparity to less violent and destructive day-to-day exclusion and discrimination, yes, you're right, we had that system. To suggest that that system has suddenly gone away or that it will go away if we're not intentional about making it go away, I believe, Professor, is indeed naive. But my challenge today was to hear your criticisms and to listen to you and not go to an emotional place. I have failed that challenge. Because I feel the danger in there being a major platform for that type of interpretation and denigration of this very important effort. Children in this country deserve, all children deserve to be valued fully as human beings. We are not yet a society that fully values all of our children. Some surveys suggest that 98% of African Americans experience discrimination in their lives on a regular basis. Does that negate the fact that some marry interracially? Does that negate the fact that some of my best friends are white? But some of those same friends might unconsciously discriminate against me or behave in a way that demonstrates discrimination because they don't even realize they're doing it. And what we're learning today is that it is the unconscious response that is sometimes more automatic and more common. I walk into a restaurant and 9 times out of 10, the hostess will take me to a table in the back of the room, probably facing the kitchen. Sometimes I say to myself, do they teach them that in hostess school? That's a minor insult. But when our children are locked into communities of minimal opportunity, when they are more likely to be incarcerated than any other group, when disparities in health outcomes continue to increase, I think that we deserve a more thorough understanding and investigation of these dynamics. About our initiative, I don't want anyone in this room, or you, Professor Thernstrom, to think that it's just about conversations around the country around race. And although President Clinton was a very brave president who responded to a very brave governor and tried to initiate a conversation, our work is really nothing like that. One example is a community in California that knew they didn't have access to healthy food, and so whites and Hispanics and blacks took it upon themselves to survey the community and to find out more about the availability of quality food. And they found out about the differences by race in that community in terms of food locations, but much to their surprise, they actually found out that people were paid differently by race as well, doing the same jobs, but receiving a different pay. Now, someone might say that wasn't a racial decision, that was an economic decision. It might have been both. But the impact was less opportunity and access to quality food. The positive impact was that this community discovered that together, and they developed a strategy for dealing with it together. And what we're really trying to do with communities around this country, those who are willing to do it, who have the courage, we're supporting their efforts to identify their challenges and solve them together, to cross racial lines and address school issues, address criminal justice issues, address foster care issues. Does that further divide us? Is that misguided and simplistic? Some may think it is, but the people that are doing it feel not only more hope, they feel and they see more progress. Now, we're very, very early in this initiative. It is less than a year since we announced it. In fact, we'll be bringing 260 grantees together so they can share with one another and they can learn from one another. Our initiative and our work, and I hate to call it an initiative because I know the foundation's going to keep doing it long after I'm gone, but our first goal and objective is to see a system of accountability for real progress. We want to figure out how do you measure and sustain progress. Our second goal was to build capacity within communities to do this difficult work, always in the name of children. Our third goal was to fund the research that will help to document and heighten our understanding of what's really happening in this country. When 20% and I think it's 20 and 18% respectively of children in our country live, not only of children of African American and Latino children, live not only in communities that are impoverished and in families that are impoverished, and therefore go to schools where most of the kids have free and reduced price lunch. When the numbers are 20 and 18% respectively for African American and Latino children, and they're 1.4% for white children, something is wrong. But it would take someone to ask the question and to reanalyze the data through that lens to create that concept of double jeopardy. So we're funding the work of Dolores Acevedo Garcia, formerly of Harvard. We're funding the work of John Powell. We're funding the work of David Williams. We're funding the work of another colleague of yours from Harvard, who are able to frame these issues from a different perspective. Frame the data from a perspective that is sensitive to the challenges that we're facing as we go forward into the future. We'll tell more stories, but I want to make clear, and this phrase used to make me so upset. People would say to us, is this just another black and white topic? And I would just say just, and I would, react. But the answer to the question is no. We're concerned about many, many groups in our society: Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, European Americans, immigrant children. The groups that do this work, it's defined by the community and by the context. But we suggest to you that the mythology of race, and let me just offer a little insight into this concept of white privilege. The mythology of race upon which we built the systems and institutions of this nation suggested that the less pigmentation you had, the higher up you were on this hierarchy of race. And the more pigmentation you had, the lower you were in this hierarchy. Now, yes, that was a mythology of the past. But the systems that evolved from that mythology are very alive and well. That's what we mean by white privilege. That you were more likely to be able to buy a home and choose to live where you wanted to live if you were at the top of that hierarchy. You were less likely to be able to do that, even if you were a veteran of World War II, if you were at the bottom of that hierarchy. You were more likely to be hired if you were at the top of that hierarchy than you were at the bottom. Now, skills matter. Were you educated? Did you have access? All those things came into play. But this concept of racial mythology, and I say it's mythology because the science today tells us it's mythology, that we are all part of one human family. The genome has finally dispelled the racial mythology. But that was not mythology when it was part of our nation's science. The cruel experiments that were disproportionately done was because it was justified, because it was believed to be science. So what we're suggesting is that we need to take a look at that mythology, understand that it was just that it was mythology, and that in fact we did build systems that embrace that mythology, and we need to accelerate a reversal of that. If you are at the higher end of that proposed hierarchy, you could live your whole life and never even know it and never even care about it. If you were at the bottom end of that proposed hierarchy, you live with it every day of your life. I really don't care who won the Knicks game, but I do care that all children in our society go into a classroom where the expectations are that they will succeed, and that that teacher understands the possible consequences of a racialized society and a racialized culture, the possible consequences that that has had on those children. And she knows how to mitigate that so that that child's self-esteem, self-awareness, and belief in themselves is not damaged by the way that she relates to that child or he relates to that child. I wish, Professor Thernstrom, that you had a deeper understanding of what we're doing. But I understand at this point that you do not. But I invite you to be a little less eager to negate it and to dismiss it. And like us, to watch and see what happens. Will we be better served if we don't talk about racism? Will we be better served if we don't search for innovative solutions to accelerate the progress of our children? I don't think we will be better served. But my perspective is of that of an African American female. Yours is different. But that's what we have to do. We have to hear the different perspectives, perhaps with less judgment, and see if we can't do better on behalf of our nation's children. Thank you.
Good afternoon. All right, now wait a second. Now I know I'm the fourth speaker. My dearest friend, one of my dearest friends, Dr. Tevi Troy, is in the back, a fellow avid Yankees fan. And of course, Alex Rodriguez hits in the number 4 spot in often very difficult circumstances. And given the remarks from our previous speakers, I think I'm in a very interesting spot where hopefully I'll have the opportunity to advance the dialogue and maybe hit a single here and to advance the debate. So I'll say it one more time. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very, very much. It's a particular honor and a privilege to be able to have the opportunity to have a very frank, a very difficult, but a very honest conversation about race today. And I thank our friends from the Hudson Institute in particular for not only convening this forum, but giving us the idea and the opportunity to exchange ideas, to politely agree to disagree, and to try to find a way, walking out of this room, rather than being in so many functions that we see here in Washington, D.C., where people have had the time to talk, but no one listens. I would only implore all of us that when we move out, that we try to constructively find a way to hear the lessons and hear the experience and hear, frankly, the dialogue that took place here today and find a way to advance the question that we were asked and tasked to discuss, which of course is race and racism. Are we now a colorblind society? My answer to that is no, like my previous colleagues, and it's something that we've struggled with here in the United States since even before our founding. One of the founding fathers that many people have never heard of, and perhaps you would never look at unless you went to the history books, is a gentleman by the name of Charles Thompson. He was tasked by Benjamin Franklin and General Washington of coming up with a motto of the United States, a motto which is affixed, a motto which is very well known to all of us, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And it's been a struggle because at our founding, in 1789, what it meant to be an American was you were of Scottish descent, you were of German descent, you were of European descent, but that people of color who had arrived on our shores, who had been brought to America against their will, were not considered American citizens. So out of the many that were composed and brought forth to be one, to be Americans, African Americans at that time were not deemed to be Americans. And I think in one of the most disgraceful, one of the most despicable, and one of the worst written Supreme Court cases that's ever been decided in this country was the Dred Scott case that was decided in 1856, in which the Chief Justice, then Chief Justice of the United States, Roger Taney, had ruled that African Americans who had been brought to this country were not deserving of American citizenship and American rights and American privilege. And so again, there was a fallacy to the notion that out of many that we were one as Americans because a group of individuals based strictly and solely on the color of their skin were not granted equal rights and equal opportunity. The Supreme Court continued, I think, in their disgraceful consideration of race in American society, of not looking at people as individuals, not looking at them as Americans, but looking at them strictly based on the color of their skin in the, of course, Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896, which the infamous ruling of the court held that Americans could be segregated in separate but equal accommodations so long as these separate but equal accommodations were provided. That was, in fact, the law of the land, the color of the land of the United States. E pluribus unum, in that instance, once again, had failed. And it would take more than 60 years, up until 1954, when we encountered the Brown versus Board of Education decision, where the United States Supreme Court finally stood up and finally recognized that separate and equal accommodations were hardly that. They were separate and inherently unequal. Unequal, unaccommodating, treating people based merely on the color of their skin to be put in substandard, subhuman, and offensive circumstances. And from 1954, we arrived to the Kennedy administration in the early 1960s. And President Kennedy was the first American president who specifically not only issued an executive order dealing with the issue of affirmative action and looking to have the opportunity for people to have an affirmative access and an affirmative opportunity to achieve the American dream, but the president also famously said before he was assassinated in 1963 that color should have no place in American law and American life. Color should have no place in American law and American life. And this is certainly something that we've struggled with since the 1960s, the Civil Rights era, the Civil Rights movement, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We took steps as a nation to try to stamp out the badges of inequality that had really plagued this country since even before our founding, to try to strive for that better vision, that better essence of what it's meant to be an American, recognizing from our various backgrounds, our various ethnicities, that we could come together, that we could overcome the inequalities that we had faced in this country to form one nation, which was the United States of America. And I say that because you look at our legacy and you look at so many of the things that we've overcome as we moved out of the Black Power era in the 1970s and moved into the 1980s, something from a societal aspect changed. We had a television show that was the most highly rated show on American television in the 1980s, called The Cosby Show, that looked at an American family with a doctor and a lawyer and well-educated children. And these children were witty, they were good-looking, the parents were witty, they provided and fostered a very strong home atmosphere of a family that happened to be black. And I think that the cultural shift that the Cosby Show brought about in America was one which paved the way for so many other athletes, authors, and individuals to achieve a bit more of that American dream, because people could look past the color of skin and look at the content of the individual, be it as their musician skills, as their skills as a musician, their skills as a thespian in the theater, and recognize that people had inalienable rights and inalienable talents, not based on the color of their skin, but because they were Americans. And yet, sadly, what we saw from the progress brought about by the Cosby Show in the 1980s, we saw, I think, what started a reversal of so much of the progress that we had had when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education, a landmark achievement. In a speech held just blocks from here, Bill Cosby had been given the opportunity to share the platform, and he had come up to remark about the progress that we had made as a country. And the people who were assembled thought that they were going to hear a celebration of Brown, an embracing of what the barriers that had been broken down had become. And instead, Mr. Cosby castigated many of those in the audience before him. And he said, "You can't land a plane with you ain't." We have moved from a society where we have stopped taking individual accountability for our actions, that we blame others, that we in fact foster a culture that denies the responsibility of individuals and instead seeks to blame society for many of the problems that face people. Instead, we start looking at our race and suggesting that people have done wrong by us in the past and therefore must be held to account for previous inequities. And Cosby was, frankly, astonished by the reception that he had faced. And in the days following his remarks, he had appeared on the Tavis Smiley show. And Tavis Smiley had said to him, "Well, what do you think all this criticism has come for? And frankly, what is this notion that you have uncovered of acting white? What does it mean for a black child to be acting white?" And I say that because I wrote an entire book on this subject, and it's something that's very personal to me, and it's something that's very upsetting to me, because the doors that had been opened, the barriers that had been destroyed, the chains that had been cut by Brown versus Board of Education were now being replaced and reassembled, not by a white society that was seeking to hold blacks down, but by blacks in many urban communities around this country who said, if you work hard, if you study hard, if you dare to think out of the mainstream of what pretends to be black thought, that somehow you're acting white and that you're inauthentically black. And this is something that is not a phenomenon that I came upon in the 1980s or the 1990s, but something that has unfortunately also been a stain of our legacy here in the United States since the 19th century, when looking, of course, at two great black pioneers in the form of W.B. Du Bois, some would say Du Bois, some would say Du Bois, and looking at Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington, in the Atlanta Exposition speech in 1896, was a very comforting figure to many white Americans when he said that we can be as separate as the 5 fingers on a hand. In other words, that we can assimilate together when it comes to working, but that we should remain segregated when it comes to being in a social setting. And Du Bois, or Du Bois, depending on how you looked at it, rejected that notion. And he said that blacks would achieve full equality in this country with the power of an education, through true civil rights, and the ability to vote and to achieve the American dream. And that conflict would continue in the later part of the 1918, 1920, and into the Harlem Renaissance between Du Bois and another individual, Marcus Garvey, who sought to return blacks to Africa and to the Caribbean. And in fact, he founded what was called the Black Star Line, in contrast to the White Star Line, which many of you would know because they were the builders of the Titanic. He wanted to return blacks to Africa. He wanted to return blacks and have a specific segregation that was put in place. And this dichotomy of acting white has been with us ever since. And I say that to you because we now enter a very difficult time in America, where many of the barriers that had been removed that would truly allow us to move forward into a colorblind society again have reemerged. And this time we find them in the presence of America's first president, who happens to be black, in Barack Obama. And I think the election of Barack Obama has changed our country in many ways that we will never know for generations. But I'll say one thing. He certainly shattered a ceiling that I never thought would be shattered in my lifetime, which was the election of America's first black president. The person who, frankly, was judged on his merits, who was based on his education, based on his vision for this country. And Americans elected him because he was that transformative figure. But, I dare say, not because he was black. That was part of it. And so, in the era of Obama, are we in truly a colorblind society? Has his election made us more colorblind? Has it made us more accepting of people of color? Perhaps. But in many ways, I think it shows that we are no longer headed in the right direction that our founders set forward for being e pluribus unum, out of many one. Why? Because I think that we're self-segregating again. I think that we're turning back the clock on our own progress. I look at so many of the things that Dr. Martin Luther King would frankly have been appalled, and many of the pioneers of the civil rights era. We hyphenate and we stress our differences rather than stressing our cultural sameness. And that is the fact that we are American citizens, and we cherish our American citizenship regardless of the color of our skin. I hear now in the discourse African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans. We're Americans. If we self-segregate and if we elect to stress our racial and ethnic differences rather than stressing on the cultural and the citizenship and the historical aspects of what has brought us all together as American citizens, I think we go in the wrong direction. You know, there was a fascinating book that was written in 1992 by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called The Disuniting of America. And he warned of a phenomenon that I fear is starting to spread across this country, which is the cult of ethnicity, which is a cult that stresses, again, one's ethnic identification, one's racial identification, as opposed to one's identification as being an American citizen. So how do we move beyond this? For one, I think to truly become a colorblind society, we must stop stressing our differences, and we must welcome diversity of thought rather than diversity of color. You know, I would encourage you, if you think that I'm somehow overstating the issue or not being serious, Google Ron Christie on your internet when you go back to your offices or your homes, and you find the term Uncle Tom, sellout, Oreo. 90% of the black population in this country voted for President Obama, and I think that that is as welcome a sign to get people to vote as it is disturbing. You don't find 90% of whites voting for the white candidate because they're white. Why would 90% of one ethnic group vote for one candidate? Is it because of the color of his skin? If the answer to that is yes, I believe that we're moving in the wrong direction. Is it so wrong for me to be a conservative, to be a proud Republican, to have served our country in the House of Representatives and in the White House working for President George W. Bush and Dick Cheney? To be called a sellout to my race, to be called an Uncle Tom, to be called a Clarence Thomas. Is that truly diversity in America? These insults, unfortunately, are not coming from whites. These insults are not coming from people who are of different racial ethnicities than mine. They are coming from those who look like me, who sound like me, who dare say, how could you ever think that way? Because black people don't think that way. And I challenge you, and I close with this. What is black thought? What is a black agenda? I look at the role of the Congressional Black Caucus and their founding in the early 1970s, and I look to where they are now, where they rally behind Congressman Charlie Rangel and they rally behind Congresswoman Maxine Waters, and they say that the process in the House of Representatives is not a fair process. It's a process that singles out blacks, and I always say to myself, is it a process that has singled out blacks, or is it individuals acting regardless of the color of their skin that have put them in the judgment of their peers? Is there such thing as a black agenda? Don't we all as Americans want our children to receive the best education? Don't we all as Americans want to ensure that our borders are safe from those who seek to harm us, be it through terrorism, those who come across our borders illegally, dilute some of the jobs that are available for Americans? I dare say to you that in order to fully achieve the American dream and to truly be and to truly uphold the motto of the United States of America of out of many one. We need to stop looking at people based on the color of their skin. We need to stop judging people based on their ethnicity. And we need to value, and we need to cherish, and we need to honor. And we also need to politely disagree with those that we disagree with, based not on the color of their skin, but the content of their character and the value of their ideas. Thank you all very much. I'm really honored to be with you today.
Well, thank you all very much. One point, and I want to be particularly clear about this. Dr. Christopher and Sterling, we're really grateful to you for discussing this initiative, because foundations are typically extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily extraordinarily likely to try to avoid challenges to their initiatives. They typically don't want to hear the criticism, right? And they don't have to hear the criticism. You know, you all could have said, we'll take a pass on this, and we'll just go ahead and talk to our fellow foundation leaders, and everyone will say wonderful things about our initiative, and we'll feel really great about ourselves, and we'll avoid that. And I'm very grateful to both of you for being willing to come and do this panel. It is those of you who know foundations will understand. This is a very different approach to this, and I think it does, as Sterling suggested, I think it does speak to the desire of the foundation to have a truly honest discussion about these matters. And Dr. Christopher, that means we all have the ability, I think, and the right in that context to become a bit emotional, because these are highly charged issues. And without that emotion, if we have a conversation and we go off unperturbed and feeling good about ourselves, we didn't have a conversation, about this matter in particular. Now, let me, if I may, I'm going to direct a question to a couple of the positions we've laid out here, and it's sort of different sides of the same question. Dr. Thernstrom, Mr. Christie laid out a very troubling history of American treatment of race, and of course Dr. Christopher did as well. Isn't it likely that deep history of this country, isn't it likely that it did in fact work its way into our fundamental social, political, economic institutions, and that sort of current attitudes toward, among races, current attitudes aside, isn't it likely, in fact, that there is a powerful residue of racism embedded in the structures, as Dr. Christopher suggested? And if so, what can we do about that?
Well, could you say a little more about how are they embedded where? I mean, let us say, the structure of higher education or the structure of religious denomination? Pick an example where one could say, here is a clear residue of this legacy that we can identify and combat. I'm sure the history always has carryover. None of us were born yesterday. There was no blank slate as of 1965 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But if we're going to combat something, we need to identify it with some precision. I mean, if it is true that 98% of all blacks have felt discriminated against, what can we do about that? I mean, that's like some of these estimates you see, The American Psychological Association has determined that 78% of all Americans are neurotic or have mental illness. I mean, it's such a big number, and it involves every aspect of private life. How could you possibly say, all right, we'll set a goal that by 2020 or 2030, only 50% of blacks will say they have ever been discriminated against. We have an enormously powerful array of anti-discrimination law covering employment, public accommodations, on and on. I don't know of anybody who could really imagine, and many states also have such laws. Can we have a vastly more powerful anti-discrimination law? I mean, I suppose Dr. Caldwell could complain about these restaurants and get better treatment once they see her coming again. I mean, I'm trying to deal with it. It's a very good question.
Right, yes.
I appreciate the question, and I also appreciate the framing of the response in the need for specificity. So let me offer one example. When the IOM issued its report on racial discrimination or unequal treatment, it was clear that the patterns of unequal treatment for African Americans and other people of color within our nation's medical system were pretty stark. That people could go in with the same conditions and be treated differently. Dr. David Williams has some interesting research where he looks at how pain medication was distributed for a fracture and how it differed by race, not only in California, but in a totally different clinic somewhere on the East Coast. One of the more insidious dynamics of the racial mythology upon which our nation was built was the belief that it was a physically embodied difference. And so the medical systems were really the harbingers of a lot of the mistreatment and maltreatment and the confusion. Now, of course, probably none of our physicians today consciously believe that. But because we only have 2%, 3%, 1%, 6%, because the representation of physicians of color is still so dismally low, and so many of the physicians that we go to see in their lifetime may never have had any interaction, they may in fact harbor some preconceived stereotypes that manifest in terms of how they treat people. Do we need more laws against discrimination? Legal expertise is not my field, it's my daughter's field, but our premise in this work in terms of America Healing is that you could change laws, but until you change hearts, you really aren't going to change things. And so that's why we believe providing the opportunities for you and I to dialogue, not necessarily to make points in a debate in a newspaper, but to really talk to one another and hear one another, that is the beginning of the possibility of creating the change and creating the e pluribus unum that we all want to see. But there is a legacy that is very present in our society, and as long as poverty continues to be so racialized, it's quite probable that those patterns will be perpetuated into other generations. So we're really not, I'm not saying anyone in America is a racist. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some, I shouldn't say that. But I'm not suggesting that America is racist. And I really want to disavow anyone of that. We're not saying that in this work. But what we're saying is that our culture is racialized and that our systems still reflect that. And that changing that, which is what we want to do, it's going to take intention, and it's going to take effort. And people have to be courageous enough to do that.
If I could too. Professor Thernstrom had the term the suffocating rain of white privilege. That's not language we use. On the other hand, the paralyzing denial or unconsciousness of systemic advantage makes it, is the microphone not on? Yeah. Makes it hard for us to heal if people are in denial that they have a wound or a chronic disease. And I appreciated Mr. Christie's comments. There is a delicate balance between overstressing our differences, but also minimizing our differences. And I think as a nation, as a community, we have to go through a process of people feeling they are respected and that they bring their whole persons to their work and their life, not just the part of their person that fits into the dominant culture. And I appreciate your and Professor Thernstrom's books with his wife Abigail. There are some wonderful books, one by Prudence Carter called Making It Real, which tracks kids of color in high schools and talks about how they buy into the culture of achievement. They don't feel like they're acting white when they achieve, but they also bring their culture and their identities, their whole selves to school, and their parts of their other cultures they live in and have grown up in, and in the racialized mythologies of this country, those parts get denied or crowded out, and therefore they can't be their whole selves. And I worry that the E in E pluribus unum sometimes means European union, you know, because people in a dominant culture don't see that their notions of unum happen to be their idea of unum rather than a truly, if we had come to this country all voluntarily and all in equal portions, we'd have a different sense of what it meant to be multicultural, not in a dumbing down of all of our cultures, but finding that our differences should make us great and we should use those differences. I would just say I just came from a training with corporate leaders from several Midwestern companies, and when I see white leaders in corporate America come to the realization of systemic advantage without feeling guilty, but feeling responsible, and finally understanding it, colleagues, myself and colleagues at my own, it is opening to say, oh, now I can begin the work. But if I sit here, and Professor Thernstrom had polling statistics, but the 98% that Gail brought up, it's like we can fight about statistics, but I love it when Chris Rock and others, you know, ask white people how much we'd have to pay them to be born a person of color in the United States. It was $50 million. I don't know what statistic that is, but suddenly they seem to be aware of white privilege even though they never talk about it. So I just think that this is work that we need to do together. So statistics aside, it's clear, a final thing, I mean, Ron said, President Kennedy's great words, color and race should have no role in American life or American law, but they do play a powerful role in American life right now. And our initiative is it is a medical, it is a biological healing metaphor. It is not one of rights and justice, although it is indeed that. We need to help our communities heal so we can get on to building a great nation, which as Gail said, is at risk if we don't figure out our way through this.
That leads nicely to this, to a question that I wanted to put to you and to Dr. Christopher, and that is, getting from many to one, you know, you begin from a number of, you can begin that process from a number of different places. And the Kellogg Foundation has chosen to begin from the proposition that, you know, race is really, really divisive. As I say, this is the flip side of the question that I just put to Dr. Thernstrom, that race is really, really deeply embedded in our institutions. And one can't look at that without saying, boy, that is, you know, that's a long way to go. It's not, you know, as you say, it's not a question of personal attitudes. We're not talking about personal, you know, interpersonal relationships and whether it's racist or not. We're talking about viewing American institutions in a fundamentally different way. You know, you can't look at our institutions after hearing about structural racism and, you know, have any faith that we're, I mean, it's difficult to think, for instance, that the founders' commitment to equal rights has any meaning after that. I mean, surely that was just a you know, a hypocritical, you know, nonsensical theoretical proposition. In other words, to come together, as Dr. Christopher suggested, is this really the best place to start? Is this really the best theoretical framework to bring to the issue?
It's important to understand when the founding fathers said we are all created equal, they did not include women or people of color at that time. This mythology that I described earlier was so embedded in that time that they could say all men are created equal, and everybody knew they didn't mean anything but white men. Now, the good news is they said all are created equal. And others came behind them and tried to make that real, you know? So definitely, ignorance. Ignorance once told us the world was flat, you know? And so people didn't navigate beyond their perception of what the world was. And ignorance dominated in our country for far longer than it hasn't. And I'm just suggesting that we can do better. That we can, we're capable as a nation of figuring out how, and other nations are trying, you know? In Sweden, I don't know if there is a more homogeneous society than Sweden, but they have a special commission that looks at discrimination based on gender, based on disability, based on sexual orientation. But their public health community understands that discrimination causes harm, and they are very organized in trying to figure out how to mitigate it. Now, I agree, we did some of that work here, and we do have laws that prevent discrimination. Careful analysis of the results of that would suggest that we don't enforce those fully. But enforcement is not the answer to getting us beyond this mythology. But a lot of people, as a little girl, I used to, when I heard stories about slavery and I saw evidence of discrimination, I used to ask myself a very naive question, and I would say, why? What could make people behave that way? What gave people permission to lynch and do all these things that they did? What was going on in them? And it wasn't until I became an adult that I understood that it really was a belief system and an ideology that gave that permission. We have dealt with the impact of that. We fought a civil war, we had a civil rights movement, we have laws, but I don't think we've ever fundamentally looked at that belief system and acknowledged the fallacy of that belief system. Because once we do that, denial has many levels. There's denial of fact, there's denial of consequences, then there's denial of implications, and then ultimately denial of feelings. And my suggestion is that we are just getting past that first level of denial in this country. And so what we're hoping will come from this work is that we will accelerate movement past that denial of the absurdity of that set of beliefs. And it's not about tolerance, you know? We like to say as a country, we're gonna tolerate our differences. We really just have to dig in and unearth the absurdity. This country had it wrong. And they built a country on that fallacy of this hierarchy of race. And we're all part of it. We all experience it, every single person, you know. And so I just say if we're not intentional about changing that, it won't ever change. It'll just be perpetuated.
Before I go to Q&A, Mr. Christie, did you have anything to add to that? Okay. Now, are there any questions out there relating to this? I can't imagine. Now, we do actually have microphones, do we not? 2 microphones. Why doesn't someone come forward here? Toward the front, I see and the deal is you speak directly into the microphone, right? And please state your name and affiliation. And this is Robert Woodson of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise.
Yeah, Bob Woodson, Center for Neighborhood Enterprise. I do have a question. On the premise of your program states that you intertwined your experience in a restaurant with the underperformance of children in schools. you went from there. And the question is, if racism were the problem in America, then how do you explain black on black dysfunction? And Washington, D.C. leads the nation in 21 separate categories in poverty expenditures. Our institutions, we have the highest disparity of black income, upper income. Black Enterprise says we have the highest performing blacks coexisting with the highest mortality rate for our children, living in the same city. If racism were the issue, why are not all blacks suffering equally? Second point, question is, more blacks, we have all the institutions where blacks are failing. We have 3,000 blacks every 6 months dying at the hands of other blacks in violence. That's like a 9/11 every 6 months. And they are failing in school systems run by their own people. We have 5 social service systems in some form of court-ordered receivership, incompetently served by people of color. They're being sentenced to jail by black prosecutors, judges. And so the question is, how would looking at these problems through the prism of race address that? If the perpetrators of the evil are people of color, explain how institutional racism addresses that.
I appreciate your question. I think perhaps there is an oversimplification of the concept of racism. Racism as a construct that was a belief system of hierarchy does not preclude the internalization of those beliefs. And so I think if we understand the complexity of the system over centuries and the barriers that were put in place in terms of skill acquisition, we get a slightly different understanding of progress. But I would love to hear your interpretation of the data that you gave. Why do you think that there's crime or failure when institutions are run by people of color, just as they are when they're run by others? Do you think it's individual? I mean, what's your answer to your own question?
If I could just.
Okay, I'd be happy to answer it. But I think it's we could have a conversation about violence and what begets violence. We could have a conversation about many social dislocations and what happens personally to put one at greater risk to do that. The prism, the context of poverty, the context of lack of opportunity contributes to that. We are not saying that racism is the only problem. And so, again, some people want to walk away thinking we're saying that. There are many, many challenges to improving outcomes in all our communities. We think that the legacy of racism is a factor to be considered. Most of what happens in our society today to solve social problems does not include that factor. And so we are bringing that factor to the array of dynamics to be considered. Sterling?
Oh. And no one discussed it because evil has to wear a white face before it attracts any attention. I'm saying by concentrating on white racism at the exclusion of these other kind of issues in these troubled neighborhoods where I spend a lot of time, it provides an exemption from personal responsibility on a lot of people in those neighborhoods because they are told by people like you that their problem is race, and therefore they have no responsibility for themselves.
Well, Sterling, and I'll just quickly say that is not what I say, And that is certainly not what we say.
I think anybody, it was Abraham Maslow that did coin the term, if you have a hammer, every problem is a nail. We get stereotyped, oh, you're talking about race, you must believe what Bob Woodson is saying. But that's not what we believe. There's many issues we work on. Our America Healing Project is one project at the foundation, so it does put another tool into our toolkit, but we don't go out there with one tool, and how people will solve all the key problems you raised, Bob, they have nothing to do with our project. And we wouldn't claim this project will solve all, there certainly is not one cause of any of these problems. But in a racialized world, if you're not able to talk about it and have courageous conversations, and just as you're saying, have a courageous conversation about other kinds of issues, we would absolutely support and encourage that. But we're one foundation. There are lots of other foundations working on racial issues and other issues of inequity. But this, we want to just bring this tool into our toolkit.
Yeah, and that's very important to understand. I mean, we have been working on food issues. We've been working on criminal justice issues to a lesser degree, but we're not saying that the only problem is racism. And let me be clear, we're not just saying it's white racism. If you frame this construct the way that it was framed for our culture, we all became part of it. And it isn't just, one-dimensional. We all experience it and are part of it. Do we need to honor that and to understand it and ask ourselves, is that at play? My answer to that is yes. Yours may be no, but again, that's the goodness about our country. We all get to think and believe what we believe.
Yeah, Mr. Christie, I know you've got to get in here because you're ducking out.
I'm on a 2 o'clock train. So
a 2 o'clock train.
Yeah, let me
He's
this.
in the for-profit sector, so he has to get back to New York City to deal with a client. He's not leisure class like us nonprofit and foundation types.
No, let me just say this, and I'll give my 2-second answer to Bob's question, because I think it's a very important one. I think for what I was trying to say in my speech is that we need to hold all individuals accountable for their actions. And if you look, and Professor Thunstrom has written about this, if you look at the most recent NAEP scores, if you look at African American achievement levels for math and reading, they're abysmal. And it's not just in urban communities, it's in communities around the country. And I believe strongly that the sole civil rights issue in the 21st century is the power of an education. And if our kids don't receive the value of an education, it's only going to perpetuate a cycle that has continued for 40 some odd years. And I would contend that the programs of the Great Society have failed us rather than brought us together to more racial equality. We need to finally stand up and say what has gone on for the last 40 to 50 years hasn't worked. How do we know it hasn't worked? Because we're testing and we're measuring for success, and these students aren't equipped with the skills that they need to compete in the world, and that is a paradigm and a shift that has to be broken. I would say to you, if there are any of you who have a question that you want to email me, it's ceo@christiestrategies.com. I just apologize for having to duck out, but yes, the for-profit sector that keeps me and my wife gainfully housed is calling me to the train station. Thank you all very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Ron. More questions? Yes, please, right in the back. I recognize someone from NCRP who would like to.
Hi, my name is Christine Reeves, and my organization, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, just published a report on foundation investment in health advocacy. And one of our findings is that the average black family has only 1/8 the net worth or assets of the average white family. And that difference is not explained by other factors like education, earning rates, or savings rates, but rather a lack of opportunity over generations, many of which through laws of our country. And as we're listening to the discussion today, a lot of very good, thought-provoking, and common sense information has been shared. A lot of it has been very normative, though, talking about how we should just stress the diversity of thought over ethnicity and the importance of what we should value in the American dream and how we should focus on what we have in common and focus on what we should do with personal responsibility. And if that statistic I shared was not true, I can see how we could do all those things. But since it is true, how can we reconcile the normative with the facts that were given over generations?
Remaining panelists, anyone have anything?
Well, I appreciate what you said, and I'll just use it to wax a little bit on the issue of personal responsibility. One of the dynamics of our education system is that we tend to live in silos. And so the sociologists don't talk to the psychologists, and the psychologists don't talk to the molecular biologists. And so we kind of have these different ways of viewing the world. And we say, all right, you're responsible, get your life together. You know, it's your problem. That's your responsibility. We're learning more about human motivation and the impacts of stress and internal and exposure to adverse experiences. The ACE study that looked at middle-class whites and the adverse impact of childhood experiences in their lives, and almost to the point where they could predict chronic disease based on those experiences. And then they started to peel back, and we're starting to learn more about what happens when you have certain experiences in life, and how does it affect your motivation, and how does it affect your drive? And once you understand those things, how do you mitigate those effects, and how do you change behaviors? So it's complicated to understand all the dynamics that lead to, I call it the ability to respond, responsibility. And we have to get better at putting the conditions in place that motivate. There's a lot, I mean, I'm a single mom of 2 very successful children, and I told them they didn't have the luxury of excuses. We just had to do what was necessary in order to succeed against the odds. And I'm not suggesting that we don't have to do that, but while we do that, while we mitigate the effects of the broader structure of our society, we're learning more about what motivates human behavior. So I think the responsibility conversation needs to be more nuanced, and it needs to have more of an understanding of how life affects us.
Mr. Thernstrom.
That may be too soft.
Yeah, I would comment briefly on this. That figure, I'm not sure what study you're referring to, that figure sounds high to me, but if it is true, I certainly am dubious of your suggestion, or perhaps I misunderstood, implication that whites are better off materially these days because they all inherited wealth from their fathers and grandfathers, and back to the old plantation in 1850s. That's certainly very dubious. A high proportion of our population is made up of immigrants, the children of immigrants, the grandchildren of immigrants, many of whom have not been here forever, letting the family wealth pile up. You're then comparing it with a population in which such a large proportion of households are single-parent, female-headed, one-earner, or very often no-earner families. When 70% of black children are born out of wedlock, when a minority of black children grow up with a father in the household, the opportunities for wealth accumulation are definitely constrained. The other thing that might play into this, I'm not sure how carefully it's been studied, but there could be, with families that do have income that could be saved and invested, there could be cultural differences here in which, on the average, black parents spend more on consumption goods. Other families put more away in savings. Jesus saves, Moses invests, kind of point.
Okay, now sorry, yes, absolutely.
Certainly in more recent history, the FHA redlining regulations and laws post-World War II deprived a whole generation of the upward mobility of home ownership and asset development. It doesn't reach back centuries, Professor Sternstrom, but you just have to reach back a generation to see the disaccumulation of wealth that was thrust upon people that couldn't take advantage of things, even just like the GI Bill afterwards, to take advantage of home ownership. That has been outlawed now, but it doesn't erase a generation of disaccumulation that impacted those families.
Good. Okay. This young lady is interested in asking a question, and we'll have the microphone over here in 2 seconds.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Norma Flores Lopez, and I am the director of the Children in the Fields campaign at the Association of Farm Worker Opportunity Programs. And so what we do is we advocate on behalf of farm worker children, which are one of the most vulnerable populations and underserved. And so I actually wrote down my comments. It's directed more towards Dr. Thernstrom. My challenge today was to be able to hear your point of view and to ignore the color of your skin. But I too failed. It's hard to be able to ignore the fact that you are a white male, and the same way it's hard for you to be able to ignore the fact that I am a Latina woman. So it's difficult for you to be able to understand what it's like for me today to be still treated differently because of the color of my skin. And just when I start to feel like I'm like any other American, somebody comes and reminds me that my color of skin is different. My citizenship has been questioned for no reason. I have been denied service at restaurants without any explanation. I have been asked and questioned if I can really afford what I want to buy because of the color of my skin. And it's hard to say that it's not, because more than likely you probably haven't had those experiences. And so even using your example about the White House, the fact that we do have a black president, how many other presidents had their citizenship questioned the way that this president has to this day? So racism in our laws have not been completely eliminated. People are just getting a lot smarter and creative about how they can be able to put it in. For example, look at the Arizona laws that are not really affecting you, but affecting other people that are a different color of skin than you. The child labor laws, for example, which is something that we work on. In this country, they allow for children, very young children, as young as the age of 12, to be able to work in agriculture, one of the most dangerous industries, with very, very few protections. And they happen to affect a specific group of kids, Latino kids, not anybody else. And it's disproportionately affecting them negatively. So then, my question to you is, how can we be able to uncover these examples of systemic racist structures in our country if we continue to be in denial and not to really talk about it? If we look at the structure set after 9/11 and the conversation around immigration, it's difficult to be able to deny the importance of these type of conversations. So I'm looking to you on suggestions on how we could be able to fix these type of problems without having these type of conversations.
Well, it's a bit of a barrier to conversation to being told, well, you're a white male, so of course you don't understand. That's a bit of a problem. But your personal experiences of discrimination and treatment on the basis of the color of your skin, I don't know what those experiences were. I certainly deplore them if you encountered people with racist attitudes who mistreated you accordingly. There are plenty of group prejudices in this country to go around, and the only careful study that has looked at Asian, Latino, black, and white racial stereotypes about each other has shown that whites have slightly fewer negative racial stereotypes about other groups than these groups have about each other. So even if the whites disappeared tomorrow, Latino, black, Asian conflict and negative stereotyping would still be here. Now, I don't think you've cited what I would consider evidence of somehow structural, embedded racism, you say you've been questioned about your citizenship. Well, I don't know the context again, but I think it is really too simple to ignore the fact that there are roughly 12 million illegal immigrants in this country. A great many people, since many of them, most of them who are adults, are employed. There are many Americans who feel they're taking jobs we could have had, and they would have had to pay us more to take them. They are concerned, possibly some of these people are turning up and voting illegally at elections. There are a range of concerns that I would think a fair-minded person would have to say, well, that's not crazy. I think, you're wrong, you exaggerate, et cetera, but there's a real concern there. So there certainly are circumstances where someone might legitimately wonder about whether you are legally present in the United States. Now, I know many Latino groups favor essentially open borders, amnesty for all, but that's not a general American position. And, in the supposedly more advanced social democratic welfare states of Europe, you do not find a great tolerance over illegal workers either. It's a huge issue now, including in Sweden, which you referred to. So, I would be I wouldn't be quick to say, oh, that's all racist. I don't think it's racist for Arizona to say employers must employ someone whose legal presence here has been certified by this computerized search system that verifies social security numbers. I don't think that's a racist position to say if you're employed here, you should have a legal right to work here.
But the racist law in Arizona, is it on? Okay. The racist law in Arizona I was referring to is not questioning whether they can work here or not, but the fact that if they get pulled over because of the color of their skin, that's the part that I'm talking about that's racist, that you wouldn't get pulled over, but when I was in Arizona, I had to have my boss drive because I didn't want to get pulled over and be questioned about my citizenship and have to carry around my birth certificate.
Well, wait a minute. You were pulled over because of the color of your skin? How do you know that?
I wasn't pulled over. I was trying to avoid to be pulled over because I don't want to be questioned about my citizenship when my parents were born here and I was born here in the U.S. as well.
Well, we need to move on to other questions. We're running short on time, and we're running short on panelists. If they're going to disappear, it's going to be you and me pretty soon. I can't quite explain this. Yes, this right here. Yeah, that's great.
Hi, Andrea Klein with the Total Family Care Coalition in Ward 6. We actually work with the underserved, and there are different degrees of racism within the Black community, the Hispanic community. I actually want to come to you from the voice of nonprofits that are working in the field. So much of the data and progress is made, best practices are siloed. How can we as a community resist from not sharing so that we can really make more positive change with regard to racism and also promoting whatever the issues we serve?
I think I understood the question, and we are really trying to promote more sharing. We want, part of why we're convening over 200 grantees, and we want to use our social media more proactively. It is important that we accelerate the exchange of knowledge and insights and tools and resources. And again, in philanthropy, you also have to get over this tendency we have to compete with one another for funding. But I think as the social challenges become more severe, and we actually diversify the field of philanthropy, I think that helps too. We're becoming a little more effective in how we think about it and how we work together. There's much more of a collaborative spirit in the world of philanthropy. The food issue now has a convergence that involves many, many different foundations. And so we think the acceleration in the understanding of the food system challenge we face is a result largely of this effort to work together more creatively. So I think you're right, and we're trying to do that better, and we'll continue to try to do it better.
Yes. This gentleman right here in the middle of the room. Yeah. And I should add, since we're running short of time, let's try to keep the questions as brief as possible. I know there's always a temptation when a foundation president is on the panel to state the case for your own nonprofit and bemoan the fact that it's underfunded. But
yes, I have a lot of program officers here who could take these questions.
Oh, that's right. That's good.
Phil Johnson, CEO of G-Tech Energy Corporation. Isn't it, though, fundamentally the problem here in this country is beginning not to be so much about race as it is about economics? A society and a country was built on a hierarchy of race for the economic benefits of the majority. Exactly. And that's where we started out. The classic example of what we're talking about in terms of institutionalized racism built into a system of economics is the housing crisis that we've looked at across the United States of America. Yeah. It is a classic example of what we are discussing here, is the housing crisis in America. If you look at who got foreclosed on, if you look across this United States about where the disparities are in relationship to the whole economic crisis that nearly sunk this nation, it was around housing. If I go out and I look at and I study, I'm a real estate developer 30 years. And I saw the housing crisis coming years ago, the bubble, we called it. And when we looked out at the housing policies, and we looked at the mortgage products, when we looked at the whole process of how housing was being sold in America from the beginning of the 2000s up, we saw a distinct pattern. If you go back and look at where discrimination started in relationship to the Federal Housing Administration, coming out of World War II, in those areas where people were redlined, and if we go back and look in the 2009 and 10 and 11, and look at the places where all the foreclosures are occurring, they're mostly in the places where the redlining occurred 25, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. If I look at one last point, economics is driving the problem of race in this country. We've got all of the people now, most people in America, white, black, whoever they are, who don't have homes, who have been foreclosed on, who don't have jobs, who are being discriminated against, are now in this little barrel fighting each other. And all of the ethnic and other kinds of considerations that we are about as a country are now becoming home, all of us, because there's a scramble among a small group, among the majority of people scrambling for a small amount of the pie. And that is exacerbating what we are about as a nation. It is economics at its root. A hierarchy of race was created to benefit the few. That same system now has 3 or 4 million people in America with all the money and everybody else scrambling. And the scrambling that's going on in our society has brought out the worst in all of us in relationship to what we see in the society today.
Thank you. Responses?
You said it eloquently, and there are many researchers who've tried to peel back the racial dynamics of the mortgage crisis, but when you hear the popular discourse about the mortgage crisis, you don't hear that history. And so every system in our country, the criminal justice system, the mortgage system, the education system, the medical system, every system has a unique, nuanced history that is in it is also the racial dynamics of that history. Without an awareness of that, we don't have a complete picture of where we are today. And we don't have really, I think, comprehensive solutions to where we are today. But again, that story doesn't get told. Those unique stories don't get told because we just sort of brush them under the rug. The story of child labor in this country, all of these stories have with them a nuanced history that's a reflection of the dominant mythology that guided our country. You're absolutely right, economics, it's all intertwined. I don't talk about it as racism as much as I talk about the racialization of our country in terms of these dynamics. But we all should know at least the unique histories of the systems that we're dealing with if we're going to understand how to improve them and how to make them more effective.
Yeah, Dr. Thurns, from that strikes me as being a good example, the one that was just given, of what you were looking for earlier, namely a specific manifestation.
Yeah, well, it is specific. I don't think it works at all. I mean, first of all, it seems to me very strange to say that the areas which have foreclosures now were basically the areas that were redlined back when the Federal Housing Authority began. That seems to me absurd, because the areas that were redlined in the 30s and 40s were mainly in the large cities, not in the suburbs. The foreclosures today are overwhelmingly concentrated. More than half, I believe, are in California, Florida, or Nevada. Large parts of Florida and Nevada and parts of California now affected were farmland at the time the Federal Housing Authority was doing its redlining. Second, it seems to me there's a fundamental contradiction in arguments I hear about this. For a long time we heard black people who want to buy a home don't get a fair opportunity to borrow money. They discriminate against them, though the careful studies show they discriminate on the basis of poor credit histories. But leave that aside. Then suddenly there's a totally reverse argument applying to our most recent housing bubble and bust period, where those racists lent money to blacks and Hispanics they knew they couldn't afford. They're throwing money at them, and they're going to somehow make money that way. It's a little hard to put together those two analyses.
I think we can, this should be our last.
I would suggest that, again, without a thoughtful review, I mean, the data isn't so much geographically based exclusively as to the disproportionate distribution of exploitive loans as it is racially based, in the sense that when you look at the work of John Paul and others, it's not necessarily that it was in the same neighborhoods as it was. There is a definite racial disproportion in terms of who received the most expensive loans. But again, it doesn't get us to where we need to get if we assume that one is right and one is wrong. There's probably some truth somewhere in the middle of that conversation. And our job, if we're going to move us beyond traditional divides, is to have those explorations and those conversations and not assume that they are not warranted just because they mention race. They are, in fact, there is some definite, well-documented, disproportionate distribution of the risky loans. Blame is usually placed on the people who took out the loans, and there's some to be borne. There's some responsibility there. But also it is a system which is well documented to have been fueled by our beliefs in terms of the racial beliefs. So to be continued, you know, but certainly to open up the opportunity for a meaningful conversation.
Sterling, did you want to have any last thoughts?
I'm guessing there are a lot more questions, thoughts on the minds of the people in this room or the people watching this on the World Wide Web. Again, I think it's important that these kinds of conversations in small venues and large continue to happen. Frankly, as you know, as we've said, there are good ways to solve community problems, and there are less effective ways. And we're excited about the people in the America Healing Project that are taking on every kind of issue, from Boys and Girls Club to 4-H clubs to communities working across racial lines to solve their community's problems around education and health, principally in these other areas. So we want to thank Bill and the Bradley Center at the Hudson Institute for convening us. And I know, again, I would hope this would stimulate lots more dialogue rather than any of us think we have given definitive answers to any of these issues.
And thank you all for being here today.